In today's world, the story can come in any form. It can be presented in a theater, through a television screen, in text and audio. But we have never interacted with the story and made it our own. Well, until now. Video games have been a medium of stories and interactive entertainment that has entertained as it is today for about 50 years. Nevertheless, its history follows a rich scene of evolution and impact that has shaped part of our culture. Some of us have grown with famous characters that represent various cherished memories of our childhood. But for those iconic characters to arrive, many had to contribute and create the industry that entertained the 70s. The industry of video games. It is the year of 1950, in the city of Toronto, home of the year's Canadian National Exhibition. Inventor Joseph Cates creates a 13 feet tall computer he called Birdie the Brain, which was designed to challenge a human player in a match of tic-tac-toe. Its main purpose was to demonstrate the capacities of Cates' Additron tube. However, such wouldn't come to use in the future. It was a successful machine, with the motive of entertaining a user. The first video game, if you will. But it was not really such, because despite meeting the requirements to be defined as a video game, it failed to comply with moving graphics, thus not being able to be considered officially a video game. After the exhibition, the machine was gone, forgotten altogether with its technology and spirit. They were replaced with successors to the idea of a video game. After years of several analog and light-bulb display games such as Nimrod, in the year of 1958, Manhattan Project physicist William Hypotham develops Tennis for Two, a sports game processed by the Brookhaven National Laboratory Donald Moore Theory, which could simulate projectile trajectories, providing the professor a frame to create a game with such tools. So together with technician Robert B. Dvorak, the two developers used an oscilloscope to display the game, as well as two aluminum controllers with a knob and a button to manipulate the strength and head of the bouncing ball trajectory. During the 3-day exposition, the machine was popular, as it was being used by scholars, students, and ordinary people. However, in a similar argument to Bury the Brain, the machine was dismantled and forgotten. Only after a lawsuit that will occur in the following decades, the machine was recalled, and celebrated as the first video game under several definitions. It was a game not created to demonstrate or advertise the product, but rather for pure entertainment reasons, unlike the other video games. And that is what many consider the first video game of all time. Of course, under certain criteria. But there is more within the history of video games. The entertainment medium continued to develop way before it reached its iconic arcade age, with various titles such as MIT's Space War and several other basic program mainframe computer games like the iconic Oregon Trail and Star Trek. However, as the 1970s arrived, video games will no longer be the same. As the 70s arrived, the arcade as a concept comes with computers and machines solely designed to provide entertainment at the cost of a quarter. This is the time where iconic video game titles like Galaga, Space Invaders, Pac-Man, and Donkey Kong surge. Pioneers such as Galaxy Game and Computer Space used the MIT game Space War and modified it to become a commercial game with expanded interactivity as it was being powered by the PDP-11 microcomputer. Following the invention of Computer Space, in 1972, developers Noel Bushnell and Ted Dabney founded Atari.Inc. and launched the first successful arcade game under the company's brand, Pong. Pong is an arcade game characterized by gameplay of two pals, one on each side of the screen, moving to prevent a ball from reaching the edge of their side so that their opponent does not score a point. It played similarly to Tennis for Two, although its complexity and features were way lower. After 1972, Atari had to innovate with new games as their competition began to move on, so the company began producing games as if there was no tomorrow. Such games will be Space Race, Grand Tag, Quack, Rebound, Tank, Crash Score, Pursuit, Breakout, Night Driver, Destroy, Atari Football, Asteroids, Luramander, and way more. However, video games themselves were not only an American trend. On the other side of the Pacific, various companies such as Namco, Nintendo, and Taito created and localized Atari games into the Japanese market. Namco, known today as Bandai Namco Entertainment, first started as a company dedicated to the manufacture of toys and electromechanical arcade machines such as pinball games. However, up until the late 70s, Namco branched into America and dedicated itself to the importation of games from Atari and Midway. This was done because of the rising market and popularity of video games in Japan. However, this came to a halt because of Atari's decreasing quality that would later occur in the 80s. In such a situation, Namco executives decided to open plans for the production of self-published video games and join the video game fever. The first game released by the company was GB, an Atari breakout-like copy with similar elements of block-smashing digital pinball. Soon after, Namco released Galaxian in the year of 1979, an arcade game similar to Space Invaders, but with enemies that fire back. The predecessor to the iconic Galaga, also published by Namco and ported to America by Midway. The following year, Namco will create its most iconic game, characterized by an abstract yellow character moving through a maze filled with colorful ghosts. Pac-Man was Toru Watani's attempt to create a game that will be both appealing to women and men, as mostly all arcade games were focused on topics such as war and sports. With characters designed to be colorful and appealing to younger audiences, Pac-Man was a commercial success, both in Japan and America, where it was ported by Midway. In the case of the West, the game was a complete hit, reaching about 100,000 units sold in the first year, and accumulating $8 million per week by an estimated 30 million American players. The other two companies, Title and Nintendo, were mostly dormant during this decade, due to how one of them, Nintendo, had stopped with its card making and toy manufacturing legacy in order to begin with electronics, and the other, Title, dedicated to import Midway machines into Japan and only released one iconic game, Space Invaders. But video games themselves did not only limit to the confines of the arcade. A new technology known as cartridges began to popularize and expand the home console market. However, this technology would not advance much as it was later replaced by the decade's arcade craze. Nevertheless, the time home consoles will really shine was about to arrive. However, with a baptism by fire. The 80s decade is considered by many to be a renaissance of the American culture. Crazy parents with vibrant colors began to flood the newly created mall, with groups skating through the neon corridors while they headed to the arcade. These first years of the decade became the final years of the arcade golden age, with iconic titles like the already mentioned Pac-Man, Frogger, Donkey Kong, Hubert, Centipede, and many more. However, such success was slowly digging the American video game industry into its grave. 3 years before the 80s began, Atari launched the BCS, the Big Computer System, later known as the 2600. Paired with an aggressive marketing campaign, the sales of the computer were stellar. However, Atari had this problem. They could not manufacture enough cartridges, thus reducing their potential. And because of this, the gates to third-party publishers were open, allowing new and old publishers such as Activision to distribute their games to the BCS. Some games were well made and polished, but others joined in with a more questionable quality. But the problem was solved. After all, there were enough games for the console. During the year of 1982, the library of games doubled, and the following year it doubled again, making the revenue for each game lower, but providing an increasing profit to Atari. It was a game to which Atari had the games, but the games themselves did not really matter. As mentioned previously, Pac-Man was a massive arcade hit, but its importation to the 2060 was an incredible disappointment. Other games like Raiders of the Lost Ark and the infamous Atari ET will join this burning wagon, and because of the withering quality, the dream was already over. Atari was deemed old and poorly made, obsolete. Warner Communications, owners of Atari, experienced a 50% loss, causing a panic in Wall Street. Newspapers reported the end of a big game boom, and as for Atari, it was game over. The crash of the 83 turned the American video game industry, but the other side of the world saw development. Europe received new microcomputers capable of running games like the Commodore 64, and as for Japan, the industry began to fly with both Nintendo and Sega launching their first systems, the Famicom and the SG-1000. Atari and Nintendo were negotiating for the importation of Nintendo's games, but as the Japanese company saw the crash, they decided to take over. In 1985, the NES, Nintendo Entertainment System, was launched in the USA, with the intention to expand Nintendo's market reach at a high-risk, high-reward situation. However, during the first years of the launch, The NES was given a bad reception because of the negative popularity video games were tied to. Due to this, Nintendo tried to rebrand the system as a more discreet and less childish piece of technology. After being adopted by the Americans, the machine was commercially successful because of its razor and blades business model, in which the console is moderately cheaper, but the games have a higher price, a business model still present in today's market. So Nintendo's plan was to obtain money through cartridges. Therefore, it needed as many games as possible. A good idea, but it drove the video game market into the 1983 crash. To counteract this, Nintendo launches its seal of approval.
A world of wonder and excitement. This is the key, the Nintendo Quality Seal,
which declares if a game is of high quality according to the company. Additionally, to counteract bootlegs, Nintendo launched the 10NES lockout system. Therefore, the system knows if a game is valid or not based on the received signal the lockout chip gave. Other things Nintendo made to help its community was to launch the Nintendo Power magazine, as well as the many other tournaments to increase public relations. Back in Japan, the Sega G1000 couldn't beat the Famicom. However, the system got refined and perfected, thus creating the Sega Mark III, also known as the Master System. It sold well in Europe, Brazil, and Oceania, thus providing substantial revenue to the company. However, as we return to Nintendo, Japan, and America, we see one of the most iconic characters in the video game industry, Mario. Mario is the iconic red plumber in blue overalls, which debuted back in 1985 with the game Super Mario Bros. However, the character had already appeared in various titles such as the arcade games Donkey Kong and Mario Bros. Although, he went under the pseudonym Jumpman. During these days, the two companies began to develop individual franchises that will represent the two publishers. Nintendo had Mario, meanwhile, Sega had the Opa Opa ship from 1986 Fantasy Zone, which was later replaced by Alex Kidd from its self-titled game. However, these Sega characters will later fade into obscurity. Nintendo continued to dominate the Japanese and American markets, with its red mascot and new franchises like The Legend of Zelda and Metroid. However, in 1987, with the release of NEC's TurboGrafx 16 and the beginning of a fourth generation of consoles, things were beginning to shift into Sega's favor. After all, the most influential event during video game history, the console wars, was about to start. The Mega Drive, also known as the Sega Genesis in America, is Sega's first shot in eliminating the Nintendo American market. The initial 1989 campaigns had a focus on the 16-bit power that the console had, over the 8-bit capacities that fell behind on the NES. Nevertheless, these campaigns failed to make a significant dent on Nintendo's popularity, but all will change with Tom Kalinske and its positioning as Sega's President of American Operations. Thomas Kalinske is a businessman known for his aggressive marketing style that revived Mattel's Hot Wheels and Barbie brands. However, as CEO of Sega of America, Kalinske began to aggressively promote his newest product as well as its signature game, Sonic the Hedgehog. Advertising campaigns against the NES and SNES were made targeting Nintendo's less powerful processing and coolness factor. Iconic ads like the Sega Scream and
what Nintendo don't.
Followed the Genesis success through America, making the Blue Speedy Hedgehog an icon of the Blue Team. More campaigns competing for the video game market dominance continued up until the 90s decade, in which a new challenger arrives in to take the crown against Sega and Nintendo. But before this, let's talk about the 90s. During the 90s decade, the video game industry experienced various changes that are still present today. One of the biggest changes was the transition from cartridges to disc, which provided cheaper production costs and simplified distribution, as well as a larger memory space for more cinematics and pre-rendered assets. In the bad side, we see how video games become more graphic and crude. You got titles like 1992's Mortal Kombat and Doom from 1993 that exposed audiences to violence and gore. Without any doubt, several congressional hearings took place during 1993, criticizing the violent content games presented and demanding the creation of a censoring and rating agency, like today's American ESRB and the European PEGI. However, the biggest shift that occurred during this generation of video games was the transition from raster graphics to the all-new polygonal 3D. The history of 3D graphics started with 1980's Battlezone. a tank-driving game that uses wireframe vector graphics to simulate 3D shapes that will render as 3D if seen in the distance. Nevertheless, this cannot be considered 3D as the bodies themselves weren't composed of 3-dimensional figures, but rather of 3-dimensional looking planes. The first 3D games based on standard definitions of using 3D polygons are Sega's experimental AM2 games called Virtua Racer and Virtua Fighter, which arrived in 1992 and 1993. On the PC world, developers John Carmack and John Romeo of ID Software created Wolfenstein 3D, which wields the title of the first FPS, first-person shooter game, which later in 4 years will release the iconic Quake, another FPS with the first true 3D game engine that made every object and entity on the game be a polygon. And by its open source nature, many other engines such as Unreal Engine, Golden Source, and the CryEngine were born. On the console front, various products like the Sega Saturn and the 1996 Nintendo 64 arrived, but a new player came in to destroy the competition. Inventor Kenkei Itachi and Sony director Norio Oga negotiated with Nintendo as distributors and mothers of Nintendo chips and systems for the Famicom and SNES. As an agreement to form a joint venture during the years of 1988, the two companies developed a modified Super Nintendo that could read games from the spear as CD-ROM. This partnership is what developed the SNES CD, also known as PlayStation. The modified console was to be announced at 1999's CES show at Las Vegas. However, behind the scenes, Nintendo, terrified for the huge leverage Sony had, decided to cut its ties with Sony and partner with Philips, Sony's competitor. This provided Nintendo full control over its creative licenses present on Philips' created machines, a betrayal and backstab towards Sony's owner. So to keep on floating with the video game industry, Sony negotiates with Sega of America to produce a CD-ROM based Sega machine, an idea Kalinske blatantly described as stupid because Sony had no idea how to do the hardware as well as the software. Declined by everybody, Oga and Hitachi decided to provide Sony the task to develop its own console. So in order to convince senior Sony board members, Hitachi secretly developed a CD-ROM system that will be presented during a board meeting scheduled by Uga. Unfortunately, this meeting did not help the development of the PlayStation, and it was rather criticized as Nintendo Sega were seen like toy manufactured by board members and the general Japanese public. So without experienced support and internal support, the two members shifted their project and moved it to Sony Music Entertainment Japan, or SMAJ. This subsidiary would aid the effort to develop the PS1, because the manufacture of games on CD-ROM works similarly to the manufacturing of audio CDs. The efforts of producing the PlayStation came to a halt during the time in which Shigeo Miyaruga and Akari Sato, presidents of the newly founded Sony Computer Entertainment subsidiary, questioned if the PlayStation will run as sprite-based 2D games or will run polygonal 3D games. Coincidentally, Sega released the Virtua Fighter for the arcade, the first true 3D game which gained a high popularity in Japan. On December 3, 1994, the PlayStation will be released in Japan, gaining a massive success. Although not as high as Sega's Saturn that sold 200,000 copies more than Sony's PlayStation. However, before getting to Europe and North America, at the first Electronic Entertainment Expo, or E3, Sony revealed that the price of the PS will be $299, $100 less than the price of the Saturn, announced by Kalinske himself. In statistics, the PlayStation will obliterate the two other Japanese companies both in sales and in games. Sega will later release the Dreamcast in 1999, which will be the company's last console, thus marking the end of the console wars and of the fifth generation of consoles, as well as the arrival of the new millennia. Before the 2000s began, there was a rising popularity within computer games. Concepts like shareware began with magazines giving out CD-ROM filled with demo software such as games. That is where companies like Valve or ID Software gave out a demonstration of their games, thus the word demo began. As the 2000s decade arrived, there was more of a cultural change that impacted video game culture. Of course, if we ignore the console launches like the Wii, the PlayStation 2, 3, and the Xbox. The first big change was modding. Because of the open source nature of many computer games, mods became a really common thing that created more content for the player by the player. The most impactful mod ever can be considered to be Counter-Strike, an FPS shooter game made by two programmers with Half-Life's Gold Source engine. Other mods made by larger companies had the purpose to import games to different operating systems, such as Macintosh and Linux. Meanwhile, more niche and simple mods just modified assets of the game, like Skyrim's Thomas the Train mod. Mods themselves seek to improve a game and make it more centered within a community or improve an experience. While some mods seek to obtain money, others were made with the intent to make others laugh and create a better product for the community. Another change to the video game community was online multiplayer. Before the mystical world of the internet, if one wanted to play with friends, they would have to connect an additional controller to the console. This was evident in fighting games. However, with the introduction of a cheaper broadband internet connection, online games were not that hard to get into. The genre of MMORPG or massively multiplayer online role-playing games like RuneScape and World of Warcraft allowed players to interact with people all around the world in online servers. In the case of consoles, they had it harder, as the newest generation of consoles, from that date, required an external adapter to allow online play, up until Xbox, with its Xbox Live subscription, changed the online multiplayer game, as now you could voice chat with other players, but it's generally more advised to do it with friends. Finally, esports and speedrunning became more popular during this decade, due to how the world eventually became more connected. In the case of speedruns, their objective or main idea is to finish a game with the fastest time or achieve something with the lowest time of completion possible. This is why we see dedicated players analyzing their every round they have in order to improve frame perfect moves and successfully cut milliseconds to the seconds of time. Examples of speedruns will be the completion of Super Mario Bros. From the NES, which its world record is of 4 minutes and 54 seconds, beating the second place by 30 milliseconds. As for esports, they have become the legacy of arcade competitions like the Atari and Nintendo organized events that made participants to compete for the highest scores. However, up until 1989, Korea was the nation that made the more esport scene in the game StarCraft. As technology evolved and more games were being released, esports became divided and specialized per game. You got FPS like Counter-Strike and Halo, fight games like Street Fighter and Super Smash Bros., and other titles like Dota 2 and the previously mentioned StarCraft. Industry-wise, gaming experienced the creation of new genres, such as the AAA game, which was for groundbreaking games made from large budgets, as well as the opposite, the indie game, or a game made by an independent studio. Video games have become a part of our culture, and while some of us don't directly interact with them, media sharing and streaming platforms like Twitch and YouTube wouldn't really be here if it wasn't for the rise of the gameplay. Video games themselves have started to become more of a greedier industry because of the massive amount of money a launch can make. That is why a new concept like the yearly release has become more popular, with titles like EA's yearly FIFA or Activision's Call of Duty 121. But besides more copy-pasted games, or companies like Nintendo that once saved gaming are now destroying the gaming community and making it an industry plant. But besides the many other bad things happening with gaming, such as unfinished games, overpriced games, and microtransaction, the industry is evolving and initiating the game with new technologies that come. The metaverse and VR have started to modify the gaming experience. Before, video games were simple programs made to entertain for a moment and later to be forgotten. Now video games allow us to create new worlds out of our imagination. So the real question is, are you ready to create your world?